Terrific. Um, Let me also begin by sharing my slides here on historical Sufism. There we go. Now, if I could get a confirmation from any one of the students, if you can see my slides. Excellent, excellent, wonderful. Okay, let's get into the conversation for today. We're going to be talking a bit about the origins of Sufism. If you'll pardon me, I'm going to begin by unloading some gum. There we go. I'm grabbing a cup of tea. Now we're ready. All right. So today we're going to be covering some important questions, which I wanted to be able to dig into, and bet you. But what we need to do at the very beginning is to ask ourselves about Sufism, the authenticity of Sufism, and where it comes from. And this question is going to keep showing up throughout the course because Sufism, as I hope you've realized from the first round of readings and also perhaps from the first two lectures, Sufism is a contested space. Who or what qualifies as Sufism, who is included in the canon of Sufism, how Sufism is made logical, where it emerges in history. These are all contestations that are taking place. The academic study of religion operates quite differently than the, let me just mute a couple of people coming in. There we go. So the application of these labels, such as Sufism, is going to be different depending on whether or not you're dealing with a scholar, whether or not you're dealing with an imam at a local mosque, or whether you're talking with a kind of a peasant in the foothills of Turkey. Those are going to be very, very different depending on who you ask. So we're going to get a bit into the meat of what constitutes Sufism. We're going to keep revisiting this question throughout the semester. It is going to be one of the things we want to have a lot of nuance around. So we're going to play a bit with that. The other thing we're going to do today, which is pretty important, is to keep questions of epistemology front and center anytime we're doing our study. Questions of epistemology, again, as a quick reminder, get to the heart of how we know what we know. What is it that we know, but also how is it that we know? What is the authenticity of the thing? What is the historical reference to the thing? Now, authenticity, we have to keep in mind, is something different from truth, right? Um, Religious studies scholars in a secular university are not too concerned with the seeking of truth. That's not really what the scope of our study includes. Rather, we ask what was taken to be true by different figures in history. So, for example, if I was to look at Fariduddin Attar, famous poet, wrote The Conference of the Birds and the Lives of Muslim Saints. If we were to look at his life, he dies in the 13th century. Um, we can come to some reasonable conclusions about what he believed. Now, is what he believed true? Is what he believed authentic? Is what he believed right? Those are not really the kinds of questions that scholarship asks too often. Those kinds of questions tend to devolve into polemical debates about who rightfully holds the space of what is Islam and Islamic. All right, so let's just keep that in mind as we move forward. So the role of academics is something pretty important in these considerations about epistemology, about how we know what we know. And then we're going to move into a discussion of Sufism in the early periods, and this is going to be in particular the 8th and 9th century. So this is going to be shortly after the death of Muhammad and in the early expansion period of Islam. So I have here an image of a famous sculptor, Volker Barsch, who's done this sculpture called The Hidden Treasure, and it works appropriately for this hadith that we have here, this Hadith Qudsi. Now, the Hadith is called the hidden treasure, and this factors quite importantly in Sufi mysticism. In fact, it's one of the most important Hadith. Now, for those of us who don't remember or may not know what a Hadith is, a Hadith is usually understood to be the sayings or life actions of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, as recorded by his companions and close associates initially in an oral tradition, and which evolves into a written tradition within about 250 years after the death of Muhammad. So initially during this period, so for example, when the Hadith compilers are coming along about 250 years later, what their concern is that the scope of the sayings of Muhammad have massively exploded. We are dealing with Hadiths on almost every issue. So, for example, if two neighbors were arguing over a lemon tree, and the lemon tree was planted on one side of the plot, but all the fruit happened to fall on the other side of the boundary line, who gets the fruit? So there might be a hadith on that, or at least there might be a fabricated hadith on that. For example, one neighbor might say, is he who raises the fruit, he who raises the tree should benefit from the fruit. And on the other side, the person might say, he who picks the fruit off the ground has a right to its enjoyment. So, I mean, these are not real hadith, these are just me extrapolating. But what you can see is in the tradition, if you were claiming right, so I have a right to this thing, the highest claim of right that you could potentially manufacture in the Islamic context is the argument that the Prophet is on your side, or the Prophet has made an argument that is in agreement with you. Now, for Hadith scholars, it became extremely important to sift through this massive tradition to try and reduce it to the things which either could be authenticated by conforming to the general logic that they were applying to the Prophet and to his ministry and to what's being said in the Quran. In addition, there were questions about the nature of who the revelation is coming from. So, for example, if a person had a reputation for being a drunkard, they would be the kind of utterances that they would say about the life of Muhammad. So, for example, if he would say, I saw the Prophet enter the marketplace and he only ever entered the market with his right foot, for example. So that would be a hadith which also gives you a sense of sunnah. Sunnah is where we get the word sunni from. Sunnah also refers to the practices of of the Prophet Muhammad in his life. So, for example, if he's entering the market with his right foot, the argument is that people should enter the market with their right foot. But if that was recited or that was recalled by someone with a reputation for untruth, for example, a drunkard, that person, the hadith would be qualified, would be rated as weak, or would be rated as a poor hadith, but may still be preserved in the tradition because a lot of the scholars at this time are experiencing a certain anxiety about discarding or keeping things when they're not 100% sure. So there's this sense that we should keep it, but we should flag it. We should label it to be a little bit unnerving. So what about this thing Qudsi? So where does this hadith Qudsi come from? What is a hadith Qudsi as different from a strong or a weak hadith? We're going to get a little bit into this because it goes something to the heart of what Sufism is and perhaps also what our responsibility is when studying the tradition. Let's take this hadith and see what it says first. So the hadith says, I was a hidden treasure and I yearned and I loved to be known intimately. So I created the heavens and the earth so that they may know me intimately. This is the translation from Omid Safi in his beautiful book of poetry and some hadith translations from 2018 from Yale. I highly recommend Radical Love as a book. And also, it's got a beautiful story of love tied up in it. Omid Safi was translating these while he was falling in love with someone new after the dissolution of his marriage. And he found that these verses of love in Islam gave new power to his own experience of earthly love. And in this case, he's translating these verses. So let's look at the hadith, right? On the front on one of the markers of this kind of hadith is it has God's speech in it. Now, Muslims generally understand the Quran to be the speech of God as delivered by his angels to the Prophet. So, in this case, how come this then isn't included in the Quran? The suspicion is because there is no positive assertion by Muhammad that this should be included in the Quran, is that it is not. But it is recalled in the early tradition. So let's go a little bit into what the controversy surrounding a hadith like this might be. Hadith Qudsi. Where does this come from? So let me give you the example of Ibn al-Hajar al-Haytami. This is from 1566. He's an important muhadith or a scholar of the hadith. He's very important in particular in the Sunni Shafi school of jurisprudence. And he studies at Al-Azhar University, which is one of the oldest universities on the planet, featured right here, although you're seeing aspects of its modern architecture here. On right, we have some aspects of it which have survived from very long ago, but rather obviously, I can't show you a photo of that. Oh, well, what does this scholar have to say about Hadith Qudsi? So he says, the words of God come in three forms. The first and most honored is the Quran, which is the most eloquent and the most miraculous form of the words of God. This form is immune to changes and distortions. Every letter of it is equal to 10 letters of other words and is superior to other words of God. The second form consists of the books of earlier prophets before they were distorted. This is referring to the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, the so-called New Testament, and others. These are references to them. For Muslims, there's a general consciousness about something called the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book. And the assertion is that peoples who had a book may be of a special classification because they may have received prophetic wisdom from the past. And so that the books of other religions are something worthy of study. But whether or not someone fits into the category of Ahl al-Kitab or not is a disputed issue. So, for example, when the Muslim conquests first reach India, within the first 50 or so years after the death of Muhammad, when the Muslims first arrive in India, there is a serious question as to whether or not Buddhism is going to be classified as an Ahl al-Kitab because they have something like the Lotus Sutra, or is Hinduism going to be classified as a people of the book because they have the Vedas. So this and these issues are going to come up early on for the Muslims, but here Al-Haytami is referring to them as a good thing to look at. And this word that's used, distortion, that is the term in Islamic studies, not Islamic studies, my apologies, but in Islamic sciences like Muslim sciences and scholarship and knowledge seeking. That's the word that's often used for why it was necessary that Islam come into the world at all. In the understandings of Muslims, the sense is that God is like the hidden treasure mentioned in the hadith before, and God is emanating God's will through prophets. And those prophets are receiving messages, but because those messages are not carefully preserved, or that they become distorted. And that's why a newer revitalization needs to be sent. But within the Quran itself, there is a reaffirmation. For example, in the Quran, it says that no one can imitate any part of this, and it cannot be distorted, and it is protected by God. I mean, that might also be a rather convenient thing to include in your scripture, right? If you didn't want anyone to question it, you may want to include a verse saying that no one should question this. But the Quran has that, and because Al-Haytami is a sincere believing Muslim, he is taking that to be gospel, as it were. The third form of knowledge he refers to are those words of God known as al hadith al Qudsiya. These are in the form of al akhbar al ahad, the individual or isolated al akhbar al ahad, the individual or isolated narrations which the Prophet has narrated to us from his Lord. Hence, this form of words is attributed to God even though at times it's attributed to Prophet Muhammad since he narrated them from God. Okay, so what Al Haytami is arguing, and what a lot of Sufis will also argue, is that the Hadith Qudsi are a special category of Hadith. They range in number between 40 and 200. You'll find different numbers based on which collection you go with, whether you're going to go with a Shia collection or a Sunni collection. You will find there will be quite a little bit of variance in those. But in general, the Hadith Qudsi tends to operate as for Sufis as a declaration by Muhammad, which is an extra Quranic revelation. So it is greater in value, they believe, than a normal hadith, but not quite as great in value as other revelation or the Quran. A scholar like Louis Massignon, a very famous French scholar of mysticism who studied a lot of Baghdadi Sufism, in particular Mansur Halaj, he commented that these hadith were not authentic hadiths, but rather ecstatic declarations that were circulated as hadith before the corpus was standardized. What exactly does that mean? Another thing that's pretty important to understand is the early Islamic community is constantly engaging in debates about questions of piety, questions of whether or not someone is a committed person of God, whether they are a hypocrite, whether they're two-faced. These are the kinds of questions and interrogations which are occurring whenever people assert a religious or a holiness claim. All right. So there is a sense that in this early Muslim community, that God has not stopped talking to people even though the prophet is gone. The sense is that revelation and the period of revelation, for example, in the type of the Quran has ended. However, people may still have access to God through mystical experience, through religious experience. The example of that is the example of the Prophet himself. When the Prophet ascends to heaven, there's an important night in Islamic mysticism, where the Prophet ascends to heaven on a beast that has the face of a woman. The Burak arrives in Mecca, it flies him to Jerusalem, and then he ascends through the various stages of heaven. For the Sufis and for Muhammad's companions, actually, this was a real question. Did this really happen? Did you, Muhammad, really fly from Mecca to Jerusalem and then up to heaven and then back again in one night? Or was it a mystic experience? This was something that was debated a little bit in the early tradition. There was uncertainty whether or not people could put their faith that this kind of a journey was even possible, or whether or not it could be imagined as as a religious or a sacred encounter. For example, the kind of encounter that Moses may have in the case of the burning bush, as mentioned in the Bible. So these mystics, many of them claimed to encounter God in their dreams, or in claim to have encounters of God while they were walking and living their lives. And based on their piety, or based on the recognition of their piety, sometimes it was claimed that the declarations that these people were making had the value of a hadith, or had the value of the saying of Muhammad. Now, that's quite a claim, right? That's quite a claim to make. But the many people who heard these claims sincerely believed them. So either the person that they were encountering was so deeply committed to their piety that you believe that whatever they said was true, or alternatively, it resonated sincerely with what you knew of the Quran, and therefore would act as a way of kind of adding new gloss, allowing us to see more clearly. Okay, um, so um, this hadith shows up in Sufi theology in the following ways. This is taken from a PhD dissertation by Moin Afnani called Unraveling the Mystery of the Hidden Treasure. If you are interested in a further discussion and analysis of this, I highly recommend you check his work out. His PhD dissertation is available for free, as I understand it, online, and also available through ProQuest for students who are interested. But he breaks down the operational function of that hadith in the following ways. He says what's going on in it is firstly, there's a concept of being asserted, or wajud, the absolute being or oneness of God as the hidden treasure and as a separate category of ontological existence. What does that mean? On a very basic level, what it's saying is God's existence is not like our existence. So when the Quran refers to something like God's hands, it may be an allegory or a metaphor for power. When it refers to God's face, sometimes in Arabic, the word for face is also used to mean the word as the essence of the thing itself, right? So when we are referring to God's face, we are not referring to a face in the sky. We are not thinking about Michelangelo on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. That's not the kind of old man, graybeard God reaching out to touch Adam. That's not the kind of God that is being considered here. This is an ontological abstraction, something which cannot be conceived, right? Which cannot be known by known ways of knowing. If I was to complicate it. Okay. In addition, this concept of this category of existence, it's conceived of as ahadiyya, the station of the unicity of God, where the divine names and attributes are non-existence. This is the state of pure essence. So, for example, one thing that's pretty important in kind of everyday Muslim practice is to think on the attributes of God. Now, again, these are not attributes as we can conceptualize them. If we think of God as an ontological abstraction, and we're not thinking of hands as hands, then we're going to be thinking of the nature of God as revealed through the Quran. And in Muslim practice, they have not reduced, but they have uh, kind of something it's called the 99 beautiful names of God, and those are all reflections on an aspect of God's traits. They're not usually abstracted out alone. They're often spoken of together and how it's complicated. But here, what the kind of Hadith Qudsi is doing is it's pulling all of them together. So all of the traits of God, whether God is a punisher, whether God is a forgiver and a redeemer, these are all different aspects of those 99 traits. God is brought together in oneness, in an absolute unity in this case, right? The other issue here is Wahidiyya, the station of oneness from God, whereas in the divine names and attributes find existence, such as other themes as primordial dust and holy emanations. Now, emanationism, for those of us who may be familiar with mysticism, sounds a little bit like Neoplatonic philosophy. If we're talking about Augustine, if we're going to talk about the idea of the great chain of being, we're going to get into that discussion a bit more later this semester, but it suffices it now to be conscious of the fact that Islam is going to, by the 10th and 11th centuries, co-opt Platonic mysticism, and in fact, it's going to thrive in cities such as Basra and Baghdad. So, if you are looking for Platonists in the world in the 10th century, you would do better to go to Baghdad or Basra than you would in Athens or Carthage or Constantinople. Okay. Next is the concept of self-disclosure of God and the loci of manifestation. Again, the idea that God is a hidden gem that longs to be known or wants to be known. The concept of love here is inserted. Divine love is the motivation for creation, the manifestation of divine love in the physical world, and the forms and stages of love. This is going to come out throughout the semester. Suffice it to say now that love is not being hard contrasted with fear. It is possible to love and fear simultaneously, at least in the early Sufi tradition. By the medieval period, you're going to see the fear being replaced more by love. And in fact, the argument that is going to be made by a lot of mystics is that fear will end when you reach a certain stage of sophistication when all you can see is the love. All right. And in addition, the hadith deals with the concept and the process of creation and the concept of knowledge and marifa and knowledge of the divine and levels and forms of knowledge. Okay, this marifa is a reference to there's a verse in the Quran that refers that when you know the truth, that you will start to weep. That there's a consciousness that we have a built-in truth detector, and when we encounter it, it brings forth this kind of emotive response. All right. So just to return to our hadith, you can see that from a mystic perspective, the idea that God is a hidden treasure is kind of extraordinary because often the Quran is also referred to as a clear revelation. So how can the Quran both be clear and yet be pointing at this mystery of the hidden? And for many, and Sufis in this early period, there's going to be this distinction between the Zahiri, or the kind of clear interpretation of the Quran, and the Baitani, the unclear or mystical or hidden. And this kind of dualism that's inserted fairly early on into the tradition and its thought persists to this day, and arguments, of course, beginning back then, persist to this day as to whether or not this is authentic or true, or whether it's an extrapolation by those drunk on themselves. Any questions at this stage before we move a little bit further in? Just, yep, let me check. All right, great. Well, seeing none, please feel free, of course, whether you're a member of the public or attending in as a student, to post your questions in the chat, and I will try and get to them in a timely manner and answer them to the best of my ability. So let's move forward. So we have this Hadith Qudsi that gives us a sense, a little bit about how mystics are approaching God. It's almost like in this, it's you know, when I first read this hadith, I read it almost like a child hiding in excitement to be found, right? So when you play hide and seek with children, as some of us have the pleasure of being able to do during this COVID lockdown, um, my kids will hide, sometimes pull a sheet over their head, and they will tremble with the excitement of being found. And that's what I felt when I first read this hadith. Of course, not to make God my child and my child my God, although sometimes it feels like I'm ruled that way. But in the sense is that the hadith is inviting this relationship of friends and lovers of God to be close. And this is going to come up a bit more in today's lecture as well. Okay. So back to this question of what is Islam and what is Islamic. Let's be as clear as we as we can be on this issue before we move a little bit further forward. In this extraordinary book, What is Islam by Shahab Ahmed, and if you are interested in checking it out, I really highly recommend to members of the public and students also that you go to the webpage on Princeton's website for What is Islam, and the first chapter is available to you there. And the first chapter is 100 odd pages long, so they're effectively giving you a major chunk of his book. And this first chapter deals with 6 questions about Islam. And what Shahab Ahmed is asking in this entire book is, what is the importance of claiming this descriptor Islamic? So, for example, if a person is a Muslim, is thereby everything that that person does Islamic? I doubt it, right? But then, what about things which fit and do not fit in the tradition? So, for example, is there an Islamic way of drinking wine? Is the question Shahab Ahmed might asks. And so, if you look at the coin on the cover of this book, what you see the figure holding is a wine cup. And around him, he is described as the defender of Islam, but that cup which is in his hand, which is now at the Rhode Island School of Design at RISD, says in it for the consumption of wine. So, is there, even though Islam prescribes in many cases intoxicants, including wine, including specifically date wine, um, how come there's the emperor whose face is embossed in this coin is in the act of drinking it, drinking wine, like something which is on one level prohibited? And how come when we read the emperor's name out on Friday on during the khutbah, how come we're reading out the name of a guy who's consuming wine? And what Shahab Ahmed's argument will be is that on the one hand, wine is prohibited, but on the other hand, the region such as Shiraz, where you're going to get Shiraz wine from, when you are in the region of Shiraz, they have cultivated grapes for over 1,000 years and drunk wine. So how can it be that simultaneously you have a prohibition and at the same time it is being widely consumed? So then his question might be, is I'm not meant to enter into this discussion polemically. I'm not meant to argue, is there an is it prohibited or is it permitted in Islam? Because that question does not matter. What matters is, what are people on the ground doing? What are Muslims doing? And maybe what we can assume is that if they are doing it this way and ascribing it to their religion, is their Islamic way of doing it. So, for example, if you drink wine without getting drunk, you may avoid some of the criticisms included in the Quran about the consumption of wine. So maybe that's an Islamic way of drinking wine. Or alternatively, if you were to go to the various bars in town and look at who has been purchasing drinks at those bars, I bet you would find a lot of names that look Muslimish, right? And so, how do we reconcile that fact with a prohibition in Islam, despite the fact that people are actively engaging in it? Is it just that they are sinners, or is it that they are engaging in a tradition that has been constant in Islam as well? That there both is a recognition of the prohibition and engagement in the act. Like, for example, that happens even in Christianity and other things. So there's a recognition that we shouldn't eat shrimp, according to the Bible, but yet we find ourselves doing that. So is there a Christian tradition of eating shrimp despite the fact that there's an injunction against it? Perhaps, right? Um, so this is a question that is important for Shahab Ahmed, and his conclusion is that Islamic is always a term which has to be asserted by a scholar, or be asserted by a person looking at the tradition. That it's not good enough to say that it is or it isn't, because that requires that the scholar insert themselves into a polemic argument and make a decision which we have no real basis of doing. In addition, if you look at the end of a fatwa, so in a religious pronouncement, the signature line at the end of almost every fatwa that has ever been written says, "and God knows best." And what that is, in fact, is the scholar reflecting on their humility and saying that even though I have made this decision, I'm going to cover my bases. It's the CYA clause, right? That I'm going to cover your so that clause is kind of is used at the end of the hadith, sorry, at the end of the fatwa, to kind of cover my responsibility for how I have analyzed something. Now, Shahab Ahmed, and I've summarized him in my own words here, is he says the issue is not for the scholar of religion to make coherent what is not coherent. So, for example, if you have drinking and the prohibition of drinking, is it my responsibility to say, even though it's prohibited, it happens, or am I meant to make a value judgment on that? And Shahab Ahmed's suggestion might be, it is not my job to make a value judgment on that. Rather, it is to raise the contradictions and explain how the category itself might be the problem and not the thing being practiced. So the category of Islam should necessarily, he would argue, include drinking and not drinking, even though there are going to be polemicists on both sides who are going to condemn the other, right? So we have to put, he's saying, instead of erasing difference, instead of erasing conflict, instead of erasing debate within the tradition, rather, the job of the scholar is to highlight the fact that the debate exists and that it has not been concluded. All right. So I do highly recommend that if you are interested in a difficult book, this is not easy reading. This is a very sophisticated level of engagement, and it will not be easy for most people to engage. But if you are interested in how scholars talk about these questions and why one thing or another thing or one discussion or another discussion makes it into this class, one of the bits that's important is I follow Shahab Ahmed. I agree with him, and I think he comes out of the strongest current tradition in Western scholarship, which is to say that we should not be in the business of manufacturing Islam in our courses about Islam. So when I teach Introduction to Islam, I should not be in the business of making good Muslims out of my students. I'm not interested in that at all, actually. All right, great. Then we are going to go to the work of another scholar who we worked on a bit today, and his name is Alexander Knish. And for the students who had readings assigned to them for class today, Knish is dealing with these same questions about where does Sufism come from, what are the origins of Sufism, um, and here he's describing some of the early traditions of Sufism. He's going to make the claim here that the fact remains obvious that early Muslim devotees to this thing called Sufism were driven by religious sentiment that expressed itself in a wide variety of ways, such as despondency, self loathing, a fear of God, constant contemplation of the truth of revelation, supererogatory acts of piety, such as extra prayers, extra fasting, that kind of thing, the indifference to the mundane preoccupations of the lay majority. This would be non-participation in a trade, is quite common. And last but not least, an intense and constant introspection and fear of God. So, if one was to say, what is the easiest way to break out the early tradition of Sufism from the medieval and later periods of Sufism? At this early stage, we are going to find that the Sufis are obsessed with this taqwa, with this fear of God in this early stage. And for them, reflecting on that anxiety is extremely important. In addition, I'm going to give you just a bit more of what Knish has to say. He says, in sum, the phenomena that we will call Sufism, which has been so painstakingly and elegantly designed by the human imagination, or rather by a long series of individual imaginations, is real in the sense that it has long ranging, tangible, socio political, practical, cultural, and institutional implications. Sufism's followers imagine it to be the only correct way to God, and therefore feel obligated to defend it. Occasionally, as we will see, they're even ready to give their lives for the sakes of its ideals and its values. Sufism's opponents, on the contrary, imagine it to be a gross violation of the correct Islam of its pious forebearers, and consequently attack it without mercy. Um, Outsiders see it as an important variant of the ascetic, mystical lifestyle and belief system that is continually fascinating, either perceived or real as an anti establishment, free thinking, and a liberating aspect, because also it has benefits in Muslim societies. Regardless of these conceptualizations, in the end, Sufism stands tall, an imposing monument to human creativity, a wholehearted and often disinterested commitment to a lofty spiritual ideal and to achieving perfection in word and deed. That's from Knish's Sufism, A New History of Islamic Mysticism on page 40. So, what Knish is talking about is often when we study Sufism, there has been this tendency in our scholarship to say, is it does it originate in Christianity? Does it originate in Zoroastrianism? Does it originate in the Platonic thought? Where exactly does this Sufism come from? And that sort of that warrants a little bit of reflection. So its sources are going to be a little bit is going to come from the Quran and certain ways of reading the Quran. Another aspect of it is going to be the connection with secret knowledge, that there's going to be a belief amongst certain Muslims that Muhammad conveys some secret knowledges or secret learnings to his cousin Ali, cousin and son-in-law Ali, and then Ali in turn teaches that to his followers, and this goes on down through the lines of descent, which is why, in particular, you're going to see Ali showing up in Sufi meditations, whether they be Sunni or Shia, although Shias will tend to ascribe a higher a higher quality to Ali, almost that he is infallible in notions of doctrine, which is something that mostly Muslims would only attribute to the Prophet Muhammad. But for the Shia and Sunni, for the Sufis, there's this deep and intimate connection with Ali. So, for example, if you were to listen to the beautiful qawwalis of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, he will have a number of songs where he'll talk about Ali Mola, like Ali, my master or my teacher. And what he is doing in that case is he is hearkening directly to this intimate connection that is claimed by these chains of Sufi history. All right. Um, so let's look as to how this Sufism emerges in this early period. Now, I do think, just so we're perfectly clear, I do think Sufism is deeply impacted by Christianity, and Christianity that exists in the spaces into which Islam is going to expand. So Sufism is going to be derived, I think, a little bit from Christian monastic practices, but also there is going to be an organic growth of Sufism. The reason why it may be important for us to deal with both sides of this issue is, number one, conservative Muslims have a real problem with things that aren't Islamic, which were then folded into the Islamic tradition. Well, I mean, they're going to have a real problem with certain aspects. They're going to love certain parts of it. They're going to hate other parts of it. But on the other hand, often so when something is described as having roots outside of Islam, that is an indicator for a lot of so-called conservative Muslims to reject something. But if you see Christian monasticism and Christian pietistic behavior as growing organically out of how the environment is translating the Bible. So, if Saint Simeon and the Syriac church fathers are translating the injunctions of Jesus into action, and this is the action that they are choosing, such as isolation, self isolation, prayer. Saint Simeon, of course, very famously sits on a 12-foot high pillar in the middle of the desert. Then maybe Muslims organically come up with the same sort of thing from the Quran. Also, I believe that it's a mistake to say that something is entirely dependent on another tradition, when very clearly the difference between Saint Simeon and early Sufi ascetics is clearly going to be whether or not they depend on the Quran. So Saint Simeon, of course, is not interested in the Quran. I mean, he's dead before it. So in the case of Muslim saints, they have a deep commitment and a deep relationship to it. So on some level, if this is like, take for example a stew, right? So if you make a stew in Europe in the 7th century, you make a stew in China in the 7th century, and you make a stew in Baghdad in the 7th century, each of those stews is going to be quite different, but we would all call them stew. Replace stew in this case with mysticism, and maybe we're getting a little bit closer to what Knish is talking about, at least when he talks about it originating in a variety of different places. Okay. Is there Quranic sanction for Sufism? Might be a legitimate question. So let me talk. There's not, again, the Quran is not going to directly discuss this practice. It was not a historical reality at the time of the revelation of the Quran. But it is worth mentioning that when the Quran is first revealed to Muhammad, it is revealed during a period of isolation, which he has gone into a meditative retreat in a mountain away from the city of Mecca. He is disillusioned with the way that his community lives. He decides that he is going to ascend up into this mountain and he's going to spend some time in meditative retreat. And while he is in retreat, he is going to experience what is claimed to be the angel Gabriel, Jibril, arriving and squeezing him so tightly while demanding of him, Iqran, read. And he claims, I am not one of those that reads. And the squeezing happens again, and the first 11, eight, I believe it's 8 or 11 lines of the Surah 96 are revealed. So there is a sense that the prophet is engaging in some sort of meditative or retreat acts, which are significant, right? In the Quran, for example, I'm going to give you 3 citations for things that Sufis will often interpret to be an authorization in some ways of their seeking of this relationship with God, or alternatively of seeking an experiential encounter with God, whether that's in dream or in reality. What we have here is Surah 50, verse 16 says, and these are all translated from Sayyid Wali Nasser and Kaner Dalgai and Muhammad Rustam's study Quran. If you are a serious student of the Quran in English, this is the touchstone text. You sort of have to have it. In addition to it, I very highly recommend the website corpusquran.com. They have a word by word etymological approach to the Quran. So even if you may not have access to 7th century Arabic, you would be able to work with sort of the most sophisticated techniques that we have available. So what do these translations say? Verse 50, Surah 50, verse 16 claims, we did indeed create man. We know what his soul whispers to him, and we are nearer to him than his jugular vein. This is a line that shows up constantly in Sufism, but it also shows up in wider Muslim practice. The idea of the immanence of God, that God is here now. It's the idea that God is as close as your jugular vein. And also that God has an intimate knowledge of my inner self. And so for Sufis, that since God has already taken that step to know me intimately, my responsibility is to reflect that and in turn attempt to know God intimately as well, is one of the ways that that could be interpreted and understood. Another is all that is upon it passes away, and all that remains is the face of thy Lord, possessor of majesty and bounty. And let me give you another related surah, Surah 28:88, and it says, and call not upon another God along with God. There is no God but He. All things perish save His face. judgment belongs to him, and unto him you will be returned. Here again, the face, we're not exactly sure. Is it a face as in a physical face? Some scholars would say that a literalist, Quranic literalist, for example, would say if it says face, it says face, and we shouldn't question it any further. But many who interpret this to be metaphorical or allegorical would say the face of God is the essence of God, so that the perfection of God. And this is the thing that mystics will often claim that they are seeking. So they will say, for example, in acts of renunciation, I don't want the world, I rather would seek the face of God. This is the world rejection that is involved, especially in this early period of Sufism. In addition, another thing that's important about this early period of Sufism, in particular, is weeping. And here we have a quote here, which is, "And when they hear which was sent down unto the messenger, thou seest their eyes overflow with tears because of the truth they recognize. They say, Our Lord, we believe, so inscribe us amongst the witnesses." This word here, to weep, the idea is, as I mentioned earlier, that once you encounter the truth, that you would engage, that not engage, but that your eyes would just overflow. It's the tears would stream from them. And early Sufis in particular were described as those who weep. This was quite an important marker. Often, weeping, uncontrollable weeping, was seen as an indicator that not necessarily an indicator of emotional instability, but if you are applying the gloss of this Quranic verse on it, might be an indicator that the person has encountered the really real. Is how perhaps we can use the language of Ibn Arabi, who will come along a little bit later to explain it. It's almost like the world is a dream and we long to wake up from this dream. And when we wake up to the reality, there we will see the face of God, is how a Sufi might describe it. Also, on the right here, we have a very early Quran, perhaps 8th or 9th century. Those of you who can read Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, may notice that there are no diacritic marks, there's no vowel markings. This blue Quran on the right would be extremely difficult to read unless you already had the Quran memorized. So if you were a Hafiz al-Quran, you would be able to look at this and know what is going on. Some words, of course, like when you're looking and you see Allah, you can tell what's there. But in Arabic, the marks around the letters, in Urdu, they would call them zer, zabar, and pesh. When you're looking at that, what you are actually looking are as the vowel sounds. So were you to take a sentence in English and erase all the vowels, you would still most likely be able to make sense of the sentence unless we're dealing with a certain sophistication or complexity or poetry. And in that case, it would become very, very difficult to be missing those vowels. All right. So let's get to this timeline of early Islam. We're going to just discuss this very briefly, and then we'll take our 10-minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to go into the lives of two saints in particular. And I have to say that the stories that I'll be sharing with you are fun. So I hope you get a kick out of them. But in this earliest period, if you're looking at this early map here, and this map is based a little bit on Marshall Hodgson's book, Muhammad and the Believers Movement. And what you are seeing here is Muhammad is going to be, I'm going to try and get my highlighter out or my pointer out. Ooh, let's see if I can pull this off successfully. Okay, laser pointer. For those of us paying attention, there is this. Muhammad is born in and around Mecca here, and then during his 40th year, he receives revelation. About 10 years after that, he moves from Mecca to Yathrib, which will be renamed Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. Which is why it's called Medina, which is a really weird name for a city to be called the city, but that's why. Um, and he will spend his life sort of right in this area right here. And then what we're going to see very early on is in the first phases of Muslim expansion after the death of Muhammad, we're going to see expansion outwards, all the way to include Kufa, to include Basra, where the two saints that we're going to be talking about later will show up is right about here. We're going to go all the way over into Egypt. We're going to have the founding of Cairo taking place a little bit after the events that we're looking at on this map. The claiming of Damascus, which is going to be one of the oldest and most important cities in this area, and also eventually the taking of Jerusalem. All right. And Karbala here is marked in particular with an X, and as is Siffin. These are two major battle sites. Karbala, of course, where the Prophet's grandson is martyred. So just to give you a sense of what's happening, so Muhammad, as we said, in about 610 gets his first revelation. 10 years or so later, 12 years later, he's moving to Yathrib or Medina. 630, he will conquer Mecca, return to Mecca, and claim the Al-Kaaba, the big black box. He will claim it for monotheism and claim it for Islam and destroy many of the idols included inside, with some exceptions. There's one of the exceptions is that it's claimed that there was a portrait of Mary inside, which he did not destroy. I mean, that kind of additional detail gives you a sense of the complexity of the layers of what's going on at this time period. After the death of Muhammad in Medina, we'll have the period of the so-called Khalifa Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs, the four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And unfortunately, at this period, there's intense ferment also taking place. Ali, Umar, Uthman will all meet difficult ends at the ends of either assassins' swords or what have you. By the end of 661, the assassination of Ali will begin the first dynasty of Islam, the so-called Umayyad dynasty. And after the creation of the Umayyads in Damascus, Islam is going to fall into a period of kind of settling. So mass expansion has taken place, and the next sort of 100 years or so, we're going to keep moving. We're going to keep moving on into Europe. But also at this stage, Muslims are going to encounter other religions. They're going to encounter other religions and have to administer these populations and engage with them. There's going to be mass translations. There's going to be learnings of multiple languages. In the earliest stage of Islam, it's anticipated scholars would study Hebrew, they would study Aramaic, they would study Greek. And so in this early period of expansion, a lot of new ideas start coming in. And so it's worthy of looking to see kind of how these impacts then play out in the lives of saints. And with that, let us take a brief pause here. We're going to take 10 minutes before we come back, give you time enough to grab a cup of tea or some relief. And when we come back, we're going to start looking more specifically at the lives of particular saints and what their stories sound like, and hopefully we'll give a little bit more life into sort of the dry housekeeping kind of content we've had to do to this point. So thank you again for your time and your energy. But we will be back in 10 short minutes. Resume recording. Wonderful. Welcome back. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes sort of at this point because we've been throwing a lot of information out there. Just for a quick breath, and in case anybody had any questions at this stage about the practices of this early Sufi community, the expansion of Islam in this early period, and also the kind of academic questions around what Sufism is and entails. Just as a heads up, for myself, when I was studying at McGill, Emory University, and then University of Toronto, Sufism tended to be both under and overrepresented. And I know that's a bizarre comment to make, but on the one hand, Sufism, there were courses on Sufism and discussions of Sufism taking place at a very sophisticated level in all of the universities. but a large majority of the courses dealt more with what they were referring to almost so as a so-called Orthodox Islam. Now, in Islam in general, when we use the word doxa means in Greek means belief, and so orthodoxa is correct belief. And in general, scholars have rejected the idea of Islamic orthodoxy because they find that there is not enough consistency, or alternatively, the necessary authority to assert a doxa or to assert that a doxa is ortho. In the case of the Roman Catholic Church, when you have a centralized authority that can make determinations about heresy, about acceptability, it is much easier to assert the claim that someone falls outside of orthodoxy. In fact, if you were to look at the Council of Nicaea and those other early church councils, they are specifically about trying to set an orthodoxy for this religion. In the case of Islam, we don't really have that taking place. Uh, because of the way that the Islamic tradition evolves, there is perhaps, at least in the earliest period, a centralization of authority under the caliphal figure, so the caliphate. However, Islam, this is one of the oddities when people talk about Islam, is people often discuss Islam in terms of that Islam has no secularism, or there's no difference between secular and religious in Islam. Let me caveat that by saying Muslims, in the same way as Jews, expand their tradition to cover all of the exigencies of life. So, in the Jewish tradition, there's a negotiation about every bit of minutiae, which you can find in the written traditions about what is right and what is wrong. And almost the same thing is taking place in Islam in the various schools of orthodoxy. They are all going to argue that they themselves come up with the correct form of behavior, but because they're all in on this together, there might be Malikis, Shafis, Zayadis. These are all different legal schools. They may not agree with one another, but they rather poignantly, do not polemically disagree with one another publicly. So there's a sense that there is a certain acceptability of a wide variety of variants, and there's no pope, there's no bishop of Rome deciding what the faith is actually going to be. However, this does not mean that people don't get tried for blasphemy or heresy, or in fact, in the case of the Sufis, especially as we're going to see in later classes, there actually is an inquisition in and around Iraq, which kills a number of them for falling outside of the fold of religion. So there is a corrective force in Islam, counseling people to stay within the realm of acceptability. But in general, in Islam, because we lack a centralized authority, the acceptable variance is going to be huge. Okay. And that's something good to keep in mind as we move forward, and not to develop an over reliance on categories that come outside of the tradition. So orthodoxy, you might hear that casually when discussing Islam, but I can categorically state that there is no orthodoxy. There is normative Islam, which is based on certain norms and practices, and there is orthopraxy, which is to say correct practice by Muslims. For example, the style of prayer, how to encounter the Quran, the rules of etiquette and adab. That kind of stuff shows up a lot in the Islamic tradition, but not so much on the question of doxa. It's on the because doxa is almost seen as something that's secret within the heart between the believer and God, and so as a result, even if someone was accused of blasphemy, they would be put in the jail and given multiple days to repent, and the repentance had to take the form of saying the Shahada, La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah. You would say there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, and you would be forgiven the blasphemous utterance. A very famous blasphemous utterance, for example, from Andalusia, is when one of the leading political figures' sons, almost like a prince, um, but a prince by way of a concubine, so not a prince of the household, but a prince by a concubine, once pointed at the sky and he said that the rainmaker is certainly, pouring out his sacks of water today. And someone said that he was insulting God or making little of God by saying that, and he was eventually executed for doing that. However, that was considered a pretty rare case because there was a lot of political reasons for getting rid of the guy as well. And so the suspicion is the execution of blasphemy and the political reasons met together rather perfectly with the hangman's noose for that guy. But in general, blasphemy in history of Islam is something which is forgivable because the idea is ultimately, if this world is a test, right? If this world is the staging ground whereby we are evaluated about where we go next, since you don't know what's in the heart or mind of a person, what you can punish or deal with is the externalities. So if he externally is manifesting behavior that should be punishable, i.e., violating orthopraxy, you punish that person. But if they repent and switch the conversation from the external act to the internal ethic, at that point the law stops. Whereas you'll find in kind of westernized law, when we're thinking about something like mens rea doesn't actually only mean the independent subjective belief of the person. It can conceptually also be determined by a preponderance of the evidence, right? Because the person would be in perhaps want to lie. And so in Western law, there is no just simple repentance to get rid of the crime, right? In Islamic law, it's not uncommon for repentance to be a major component of getting rid of the crime, unless there's a specific penalty which is prescribed by the Quran or the traditions. For example, 100 lashes for adultery. Um, and not lapidation. That's a very major important point. Is whereas you hear about Muslims stoning adulterers to death, that is in fact not anywhere in the Quran. That is derived from the traditions that were practiced in the city of Yathrib or Medina while Muhammad was alive, and his sort of agreement to the concept generally allowed jurists to infer that it was appropriate, even though the Quranic injunction is specifically lashes, right? So here again, we're seeing a tension between word and deed, and act and the act as implied in the Quran, lashes, and then as it's practiced, stoning. Okay, let us shift into a discussion of a couple of saints, share a couple of fun stories. Turn off the pointer so I can advance the slides. There we go. So we're going to be first looking at Abu Hamid bin Abu Bakr Ibrahim, also much better known as Fariduddin Attar. Attar is means an apothecary, and Fariduddin Attar is extremely famous also because the people who learn from him become extremely famous, i.e., Rumi. And what Attar is most famous for is he writes about these kind of allegorical stories, which are really beautiful, such as The Conference of the Birds. I mentioned this in a previous class, but essentially all of the birds of the world come together to seek out the simurg, the phoenix, and they go through all of these trials and travails, through 7 valleys of trials to finally discover the Simurg is them. And that kind of mystical treatise is sort of a very fanciful way of bringing some of the ideas of Sufism to the fore. Now, just one caution, Fariduddin Attar is alive well after the figures we are discussing today. But the reason why we need to chat a little bit about him is this question again of epistemology. How do we know what we know? So, how do we know what we know about the lives of early saints? That is because people like Attar were writing hagiographical texts. I'll discuss what that term means in a second. But essentially, because Attar is looking at histories that were available in the eighth and ninth centuries, texts that may have been extant at the time, they may have been around at the time, but are no longer available to us as scholars, that he is looking at this general milieu. And he's drawing these stories from them, and also references in certain texts like Shafi, who's very, very famous as being one of the great compilers of Islamic law. We'll have a discussion. Ghazali will have a discussion of some of these figures. And so these are pietistic luminaries which are showing up in the early tradition, i.e., people who were practicing their faith so hard that people noticed. Okay. Um, so imagine yourself a Joan of Arc, which may be a more familiar figure, or a Hildegard of Bingen. These kind of figures who are living on the margins of society, but who are so deeply embroiled in their pietistic devotion that they barely notice the functioning of the world around them. Okay, so Attar is writing this history, and he writes this very famous biography of the saints, which has a very, very big impact on Rumi himself. Now, I just wanted to talk again because we are spending time with at every opportunity on epistemology. So how do we know about these saints? It comes we This kind of literature is often referred to as a hagiographic literature, and this comes from the Greek hagios and graphia, from holy and writings. In Christianity, hagiographic writings are going to focus on the lives and the miracles of the saints, often also on how they die. And keep in mind that the word witness, to see, is also in Greek is martyr, right? And that is going to be related in turn also to the Muslim conception of shahid, or shahada, which is the statement of witness that la ilaha illallah, but also shahid is a martyr. So that similar connection between the witness and martyrdom in Greek and in Latin, and then also again in Arabic. In Islam, the hagiographical traditions about the saints are going to become a very important genre of literature in the Persian and the Turkic traditions from the 11th century onwards, which is why Attar's account is important. Is up until then, these stories may have been known locally. Alternatively, the saints may have had a shrine or a mausoleum, and we're going to get a lot more into saints in two classes. It's a good to give us a bit of a teaser at this point. So, in this 11th century, they're writing about the saints of early Islam, so pietistic believers. Now, in understanding Muslim history, it's extremely important to understand both from the outside perspective, which is the conquests and how the expansion is going to take place, the creation of the Institute of the Dhimmi, or the non-Muslim outsider who traded a contractual relationship with the state to remain where they are. So, for example, if you were Jewish, you wanted to remain in Basra. Basra was a Muslim city. You would pay a jizya, or a poll tax, which would allow you to stay there. It would give you access to governmental services. It would give you the protection of the military, and also it would help the state would validate your contracts. So, in this kind of in this sort of experience, we're going to be dealing with sort of how is this mystical tradition settling and incorporating itself, and kind of spreading out at this point. The other the other reason why hagiography is important is, hagiography is about is its function, is not merely what is it based on and is it or is it not true, but hagiography also deals with the question of the revitalization of the faith. So saints' biographies, like the variety that Attar is going to write, are about uh, giving you examples, or giving a believer examples of pious persons, of high character, high nobility, and arguably what Attar is kind of secretly saying on the side is all of these people made it into heaven. So if you want to look at people who are going to have the certainty of heaven, and you don't want to be a martyr on a battlefield, or you don't want to die from something else in the way of God, these figures give you other examples of how you can be and be right with God. And often the stories are compilations without necessarily vetting them for historical accuracy. And this is the problem with hagiography. So, for example, in a lot of the discussions of one of the characters that we're going to look at, Rabia al Adawiya or Rabia al Basri, Rabia of Basra, she is going to apparently, according to Fariduddin Attar, have a very long and healthy relationship with Hassan of Basra, another very famous figure from this early period that we're going to look at. So that on its surface doesn't seem like a problem, but uh, Rabia was probably about 10 when Hassan died. So, what about all of the stories when they're meeting for dinner and hanging out and going for walks? How could those be true if he's dead? And one of the suspicions is the way that knowledge works at this time period is that, first off, Attar does not want to reject the story because the facts do not fit 100% accurately. He wants to share the story because the story is important to the communities that he's consulting and to the text that he's looking at. So he wants to include it. The other thing is the story has a function. The story can teach you how to be in the world to imitate these characters. So maybe they're useful in that way. But ultimately, the other thing is, it could also be a student of Hassan al Basra. So even though the master is dead, one of his students could claim his mantle, and it's attributing that connection to the student and his mantle, or the student and the master's mantle. The reason why that is important is when we deal with knowledge in the West, a lot of it is about, have you cited the source correctly? Like if you're quoting Aristotle's Poetics, quote Aristotle's Poetics. If you're going to quote Gratian, quote Gratian properly. Because the issue is that I don't want to take an idea which is not mine without adequate recognition of the person from whom the idea came. In Islam, there seems to be less of a concern about identifying clearly who the idea came from, but rather it's quite common for people to just take the idea and reinscribe it into their own text. Now, in the West, if you are a student in a Western university, you may know that to be plagiarism. You know that you sure as heck would get in a lot of trouble with the university if you just took someone's ideas and re-narrated them as your own. But in the case of a lot of other cultures, other than the cultures of kind of copyright and intellectual property, which we live now in the present, it was quite common to take other people's ideas as an act of recognition of the sophistication of that scholar. But this makes it very difficult when you're dealing with historic texts because sometimes you don't know who wrote it, who didn't write it, where's the sort of where did this come from? These were some of the kind of more fanciful claims even made about figures like Aristotle, who spent a lot of time at the Library of um, so-called Library of Alexandria, and then comes back to Greece and then publishes a whole lot of books very fast. So was he taking the ideas from Alexandria and just narrating them back into Greek texts? Was he so completely transformed by his learning while traveling? We don't know. So this question of authorship is always debated and argued in this early period, and based on some of the problems that I have encountered with students, it's an ongoing concern as well of the lifting of ideas without attribution. But that's a value that we place a lot of importance on, but not necessarily all of the figures we're looking at. All right, let's have a peek at Hassan al-Basri. So he lives from 642 to 728. He's from the second generation of Muslims. Again, in Muslim history, the idea is that the closer you are to the prophetic encounter, the better you are. So the Sahaba, the so-called companions of the Prophet Muhammad, those their insights and their thoughts were considered quite valuable, quite insightful, including sort of the hadith narrations of his wife Aisha, who gives us nearly sort of about a third of the hadiths that we have were authenticated by the later tradition, were by way of his youngest wife. Um, so what Hassan al-Basri is famous for is this idea of zuhud, or austerity or renunciation, and he preaches extensively. He's known for being a very fiery preacher and giving very fiery sermons. He's considered sort of ex post facto, after the fact, as being one of the earliest Sufis, and he's considered one of the earliest Sufi masters. He is reported to have been a jeweler and a soldier before he became a renunciant. So let me share you a little bit of the story of his conversion. And I'm reading this out of the translation of Attar by Arbery, which is available online, and also has been made available by UNESCO as a kind of a preserved text. And so that's available through the University of Chicago, or through archive.org. And were you to search for the mystics of Islam, you would find Arbery's translation. And so this is from page 2 through 4 of his description of how Attar becomes a saint. Now, there's all sorts of claims about Attar having encounters with the Prophet, or having encounters with the Prophet's companions. Now, it's not really possible that he would have been alive at the same time as the Prophet. But again, these stories have a tendency of having a little bit of slippage of about 10 to 15 years. And so some of those tales might be true. But in terms of his own conversion, this is what happens. Um, so a prime minister comes to, or a high social official comes to his store and says, I'm going to go visit a certain place. Would you like to join me on this journey? And this is something quite important, again, in these Sufi accounts, is the idea of the travel. Um, it is for you to say, Hassan replied, I agree. So the minister commanded a horse and that he to be brought for Hassan. He mounted with the minister and they set out. When they reached the desert, Hassan perceives a tent of Byzantine brocade fastened with ropes of silk and golden pegs which are set firmly in the ground. He looks to one side and sees a mighty army, all accoutred in the panoply of war. They come out, circle the tent, say a few words, and then they depart. Then philosophers and scholars arrive of over 400. They circle the tent, they say a few words, and they depart. Then 300 illuminated elders with white beards approach the tent, circle it, say a few words, and depart. And then 200 moon-fair maidens, each bearing a plate of gold, silver, with precious stones, circle the tent, say a few words, and then depart. Hassan finds this astonishing, and he says, filled with wonder, he asks himself, what is going on at this tent? When we alighted, he went on. I asked the minister, and the minister explained. He said that Caesar has had a son of unsurpassable beauty, perfect in all the branches of learning, and unrivaled in the arena of manly prowess. His father loved him with all of his heart. He fell ill, and then all the physicians proved powerless to cure him. Finally, he died, and he was buried in that very tent you see there, said the minister. Once every year, people come out to visit him. First, an immense army circles the tent, and then they say, O prince, if circumstance that had befallen thee had come about in war, we would have saved you. Then the philosophers come, and the philosophers will say, this circumstance has been brought about by one against whom we cannot do anything by all the means of learning, philosophy, science, and sophistry. Next, the elders would come and say, if the circumstances could be set right by the intercession of elders, we could have saved you. Then the moon-fair maidens come and say, son, if the circumstance had befallen thee, we could have set right with wealth and beauty, we would have saved you. Then Caesar himself with his chief ministers enters the tent and says, O eye and lamp of thy father, O fruit of the heart of thy father, O dearest beloved of thy father, what is in thy father's hand to perform? The father brought a mighty army. He brought philosophers, scholars, intercessors, advisors, maidens, wealth, luxuries. But this circumstance had been brought about by one whom the father had no control, with his apparatus, his army, his retinue, or his luxury. Peace be upon you till next year, he says, and then leaves to return next year to perform the ritual again. Sorry, I've lost my page. Here we go. Uh, the words of the minister so affected Hassan that he was beside himself. At once he made arrangements to return. Coming to Basra, he took an oath never to laugh again in this world until his ultimate destiny became clear to him. He flung himself into all manner of devotions and austerities, such that no man could exceed his discipline. So here you go is a conversion account. And what you're seeing in the conversion account is a very typical kind of story structure. And this is quite common with hagiography, is that there's going to be a few beats that the scholar is going to want to make sure that are in the text. So here you go is Hassan al-Basri is leaving Basra, going out into the wilderness. And again, into the wilderness, the idea that it is a space away from the illumination of the city, away from the scholars, in a blank tabula rasa kind of place. In it, he encounters a tent and he sees Caesar. So Caesar, like Pharaoh, is going to be a major representative of this worldly authority. And then we're going to see all of the aspects of worldly authority show up: soldiers to represent the strength, philosophers to represent the mind, the elders to represent tradition, the maidens to represent desire, sexuality, and experience, and then wealth as well. And each of these is going to fail to change the conditions of the person who is engaged, um, who is engaging uh, with this encounter. I just see a question here, and it's thrown my rhythm a little, but I'll fix it in one sec. So when he is his conversion account is his realization, like Gautama Buddha in the same way, right? Like when we're talking about Siddhartha's becoming the Buddha, the so called enlightened one, it happens because he has visions of an old man. He has visions of sickness and death. And in it, he realizes the impermanence of the world. In the same kind of way, this mystic is having an encounter in which his eyes have opened to a different reality. I see a quick question about from an attendee, although it was dismissed. I just want to make sure that I was clear on this. Fariduddin Attar is a Persian scholar. He's going to be alive and he's going to die right before the Mongols arrive and sort of to hit the reset button on Islamic civilization in that part of the world. And he is writing in Arabic and he is writing this history of the saints. So just to hope that catches you up. Okay, so that story about Hassan al Basri is a very typical kind of early saint story. It shows the saint becoming aware of the world in a particular way and then engaging on certain acts of pietistic devotion. So Hassan al Basri, this is the kind of one of the famous things about him is that it said he shows no mirth, he shows no laughter, no joy, and he spends a lot of time trembling, fearful, and crying as well. And another thing that's kind of significant is earlier in his life, Hassan al-Basri, according to some of the sources, is meant to have been a soldier, and so is meant to have seen kind of the ugly side of reality, and then comes round in this particular way. But let's give you another sort of an example from his accounts. Sorry, the conversion account is the one that I just shared with you. But then also we have him engaging in debates with non-Muslim others. So, for example, there's a major encounter which he claims to have with a fire worshiper, or which would be kind of less polemically described as a Zoroastrian. And he says he engages in a debate with this man. So this man is on his deathbed and Hassan al Basri is asked by the neighbors and the people in the community to go see the man on his deathbed because he's known to be an extremely pious figure. So Hassan al Basri arrives, is speaking to the man, and the man tells him that he is feeling anxiety or great fear of the grave. And Hassan al Basri says to him, you should convert. And the man says, well, how do I know that I'm going to get the goodies of the afterlife if I convert like on the threshold of death in the last few minutes before I die? And Hassan al-Basri counsels him to do it. And so the man takes the Shahada, says the La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah, converts on his deathbed. And there is a big debate in the Islamic tradition about whether or not deathbed conversions are acceptable or not. Most of the authorities come down on yes. So in the case, this man takes a deathbed conversion and then dies. Hassan is that night sleeping, and he dreams of this man entering the gates of heaven. And when he rises, he quotes the following quote is preserved, where he says, "I know well what thou dost is without cause, save of thy bounty. Who shall suffer loss at thy door? Thou grantest a Zoroastrian of 70 years to come into thy presence because of a single utterance. How wilt thou exclude a believer of 70 years?" And this again is reflecting his anxiety about going to heaven, but he's also he's doing this negotiation, and this is something that you'll see is quite common in the stories of Muslim saints, is that the saint is going to have a conversational relationship with God. When we sing, when you listen to Qawwali, for example, Muhammad is referred to as a thou form in the vous form, for example, in the French, and God is referred to in the tu form, in the familiar form. In like in Urdu it would be ap and tum, or tu and ap, and the tu form or the you form is a much more intimate form. And despite the fact that there is a profound reverence for God, at the same time, the intimacy of the tu implies the intimacy of the jugular vein, as we discussed earlier as well, right? So in this, saints are often going to have arguments with God. And if this sounds a bit like the kind of arguments that someone like biblical figures like Aaron are going to have, or movie figures like Tevye are going to have in Fiddler on the Roof, when he's talking to God just while he's pushing his wheelbarrow around, that's the kind of engagement you're going to see in these Sufi accounts as well. Okay, so that is this first figure, Hassan al-Basri. He's one of the earliest figures that we apply the title Sufi to. And again, that term comes from the tendency of either wearing wool garments or perhaps etymologically related to suf as in purity. So these are the concepts which are associated with Hassan al-Basri early on, and he's part of that tradition of crying and removal from the world. All right. The next figure that I would like to take a look at is Rabia al-Adawi, or Rabia al-Basri, again from the same town, which is why so often the stories of Hassan and Rabia tend to get entangled. What's interesting about Rabia is, according to the accounts, at least according to the account of Attar and a few others, and she's mentioned, I believe, in Ghazali as well, that the discussion is that she was a slave or either fell into poverty early in her life, that she earned her freedom, and either she never married, or if she married, it was a special kind of marriage in which the sexual aspects for the requirements of women were not there. And this is something quite important as well, is that, for example, one of the issues that comes up in our discussion. Just let me just put a pin in that for 1 second and just deal with a couple of questions. So we're seeing what you're going to see is in the earliest iterations of Sufism. One of the things that the Sufis are really important in doing is translating the high concepts contained in the Quran. Remember, the Quran is not easily accessible to people. It's not available as a text readily. It's also would have been very large if inscribed. It would have been very expensive to create. It would have been about, you know, that would have been if you look up historic images of the Quran, you'll see the earliest versions were about 4 feet high. So that would be almost impossible to access in your home unless you were a scribe, very wealthy, or what have you. So the relationship of the Quran to the believer would have been through the oral tradition, would have been through teachers, would have been the master-student relationship and encounters with others. So Arabic is being preserved something as a sacral language in this case, But what about the vernacular? So, in the same way that we're going to encounter Latin being the common language of Europe in the medieval period, but there being local languages, i.e., French and German and what have you, available as well, whether or not the person is writing in the formal or in the vernacular is going to be a big issue. And so much of an issue that Vatican II is going to have an opinion about it in the 1960s. But before that, the issue was, especially for people like Martin Luther in sitting in Erfurt in Germany, is Martin Luther is going to want to make scripture available in the vernacular, and that's extremely important. And so, in the case of the Sufi saints, one of the things that they are somewhat famous for doing is translating these wisdom into the vernacular of their area. So, in the case of someone like Fariduddin Attar, he is himself Persian, but he is not, for the most part. Arabic is the formal language, i.e., if you're a published author and you want the book to sell, you write it in Arabic. But by the 13th, 14th centuries, we're going to start seeing texts appearing in Persian and other languages. And again, this vernacular, number one, makes it more readily available to your local context, but also makes it slightly unavailable to people outside of your local context. So the hubris in a place like Al Azhar University, one of the greatest universities, Al Azhar may not have a chair of Persian studies in the 12th century or 11th century, just because there's nothing valuable being produced over there. So instead, once these texts become available and a vernacular form of encountering Islam becomes available, what you're going to see is the figures who produce this kind of literature become quite important as well. Um, and so this is going to be an issue with the kind of vernacular forms of Islam as it's translated down to the ground level. And it's often claimed in places like India that although the Islam spreads at the highest, at the elite levels of society amongst princes and kings and by conversion, the people on the bottom level are converted by the acts, pietistic behavior, and songs of the Sufis, which would of course be in the vernacular and not in Yemeni influenced 7th century Arabic, which wouldn't be accessible to someone sitting in the Deccan. All right. Sorry for that quick aside on language. I hope that clears that up. But let us return to Rabia and the life of Rabia. So she, as a figure, one of the things that weeping does is it makes your face ugly, right? Or at least, especially if you're ugly crying, which is a particularly distinct kind of cry. So this sense of constantly weeping would number one, it would harm the beauty of the person. It would also, if they're kind of disheveled and rent and not caring about this world and looking a bit bedraggled, the idea is that they are indicating their desire to no longer live in this world and to start living according to the rules of the next. So you're not concerned with externalities anymore. You're more concerned with the internal cultivation of the self. And this kind of language begins to emerge in this early period of Sufism in the first 200 to 300 years of Islam. Sufis will get often identified with psychological tendencies like the ego, id, and superego. And the seeds for this kind of development are being sown in the tradition in the 8th and the 9th century. The other thing about being unavailable to men means that you are not required to perform the gendered roles which would normally be expected of you, i.e., get married, have kids, and tend home, right? So if you are not available for marriage, if you are not available sexually, you are in some cases even no longer considered a woman. And so let me give you what Fariduddin Attar has to say about Rabia. Is he says of her earliest life, this is again from the Arbery translation, this would be page 29 and on. He says here, Rabia was born in humble circumstances and sold into slavery as a child and later settled into Basra. The date of her death is variously given as 752 or 801. To her, a lifelong celibacy is attributed, in a large share in the introduction of Islamic mysticism, in the theme of divine love, and her tomb was near Jerusalem. And and Attar says, if anyone says, why have you included Rabia amongst the ranks of men? So all of the other saints in his book on Muslim saints, or the awliya, are men. So there's this one woman. So why have you included this woman, Attar? And he responds, my answer is that the Prophet himself said, quote, God does not regard your outward forms, end quote. The root of the matter is not form, but intention. As the Prophet said, mankind will be raised up according to their intention. Moreover, if it is proper to derive 2/3 of our religion from Aisha, the Prophet's youngest wife, surely it is permissible to take religious instruction from a handmaiden of Aisha. When a woman becomes a man in the path of God, she is a man, and one can no longer call her a woman. So, what you're seeing very early on in the tradition of Rabia is an initial challenging to the question of gendered norms and the coding of gendered norms, and whether or not mystics are going to follow the same sort of rules. You're going to find, especially amongst mystics, that there's a lot of play, especially in terms of gender. So, in last week, we discussed a poem of Bulle Shah in which he talks about, when he says Tere ishq nachaya, he says he dresses up as a bride and dances for his master to seduce him back into loving him. Now that is a weird relationship, right? Like that's or at least it's a very intense relationship. And what it is implying is that gender is one of the outward forms. So whether or not women should be excluded from being included in the ranks of the saints, Attar's argument is no, because they become men. Now, that may not be as acceptable to our understanding of gender today, right? But Buddha says the same sort of thing. A young woman approaches the Buddha and she says, Buddha, how can I become enlightened like you? And his response to her, you should come back a man in the next life. So there's this sense that gender is an issue, and becoming a man allows you to become a full agent, whereas being a woman may have meant that you were always dependent on the protection or agency of men to carve your space out in the world. And so Rabia, for Attar, he's offering this as praise that she becomes a man, although we don't read it necessarily that way today. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the kinds of stories about Rabia. This is, for example, one of the most famous accounts of Rabia. We covered this a little bit in an earlier class, um, but she would often offer this prayer, and this prayer tends to be preserved in a number of different traditions. And she says here, O God, if I worship thee for fear of hell, burn me in hell. And if I worship thee in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship thee for thy own sake, grudge me not thy everlasting beauty. O God, my whole occupation and all my desire in this world of all worldly things is to remember thee, and in the world to come off all things of the world to come is to meet thee. This is on my side, as I have stated. Now do thou whatever thou will. So, again, what you're seeing in this early tradition is this conversational nature of the relationship with God. The mystic claims to be communicating directly with the divine. In addition, there's this kind of, I've done what I was supposed to do, and now it is entirely on your magnanimity, right? Is that whether or not you choose to recognize my actions, you choose to recognize what I've done, falls to you. So let me share a kind of a typical account about Rabia. Um, Let me give you this sort of example of how she lived in the world. So a party of men once visited Rabia to put her to the test, desiring to catch her out in an unguarded utterance. This is on page 42 of Arbery's translation.
Quote, all the virtues have been scattered upon the heads of men, they said. The crown of prophethood has been placed on men's heads. The belt of nobility has been fastened around men's waists. No woman has ever been a prophet. All of that may be true, Rabia replies, but egoism, self worship, and the quote, I am your Lord Most High, have never sprung from a woman's breast. But no woman has ever been a hermaphrodite, and all of these things have been the specialty of men. Is she sort of correcting them in their perspective to say that men have also, even though the men may have been prophets, but men have also perpetuated a religion of egoism and self-belief. And so and what you'll find is often in the stories of Rabia, she is very quick-witted. She's got these barbs that she immediately snaps back, no matter how high the station is of the person who's coming to see her. All right, let me give you one more account of Rabia. And this is the story of her going to Mecca. Oh, wait, I'll give you one of her and then one of her and Hassan to try and explain how that works. Okay, let me just pull this one up. All right, here we are. Um, so Rabia decides that she has to go to Mecca because she feels she is summoned. So she goes to her master and says, "I wish to leave. Give me permission to depart." He gives her her leave. She leaves the house and she goes out into the desert. And from the desert, she proceeds to a hermitage where she serves God for a while. Then she feels determined to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, and she sets her face towards the desert. She binds her bundle on the back of a donkey. In the heart of the desert, the donkey keels over. Men in the pilgrim's passage approach her and say, "Let us carry your load, Rabia." She claims to them, "Go on. I have not come this far by only putting my trust in the trust of men." So the men leave, and Rabia remains alone. Then she cries out to God, "O God, do kings so treat a woman who is a stranger and who is powerless? Thou hast invited me into thy house. Then, in the midst of the journey, thou hast suffered my donkey to die, leaving me alone in the desert." Hardly had she completed this statement when her donkey stirred up and rose. Rabia placed her load back on its back and continued on this way. The narrator, and this is a note that Attar makes in the text, the narrator of the story reports that sometime afterwards he saw that same donkey being sold in the market. She traveled on for a number of days um, and arrives eventually in Mecca. Now, so this kind of account again shows you something miraculous taking place. The miracle is not necessarily attributed to the saint or the power or the charisma of the saint in this particular case, but the miraculous power in this story is attributed to the saint petitioning God. So that's slightly different, right? To say that the saint themselves would put their hand on you and heal you versus the saint petitioning God because of a certain intimacy that the saint would claim that they have, and then God interceding or in becoming involved in the case themselves. Okay, the last thing I'll share with you today is an account of Rabia and Hassan apparently meeting together. Again, this would have been historically improbable given the when they were alive, but it sort of shows how the two characters such as Hassan and Rabia can be connected. All right, let's have a peek. Once Rabia sent Hassan three gifts. She sent him a piece of wax, a needle, and a hair. And this is from page 39. Be like the wax, she said. Illuminate the world and yourself burn. Be like a needle. Always be working naked. When you have done these two things, 1,000 years for you will be for you as a single hair. Do you desire for us to get married? Hassan replied. The tie of marriage, said Rabia, applies to those who have being. Here, being for me has disappeared, for I have become knotted to self and exist only through him. I belong wholly to him. I live in the shadow of his control. You must ask for my hand of him, not of me. How did you learn this secret, Rabia? Hassan asks. And Rabia responds, I lost all found things in him. And how do you know him? Hassan replied. You know the how, and I know the how less, said Rabia. Again, this kind of mystic story is the same. You're going to encounter similar tales in Christianity and Buddhism as well. Is that the two masters debating and having this back and forth exchange on the nature of what things are? And this is often the claim that Rabia will make, and many saints will make in this time period, is that their life is not their own. Their life belongs to God. And so when you approach them, so when there's another instance when she receives a proposal and the man says, Rabia, will you take me as a husband? And she says, I only have one master and I refuse to put a master between me and God, i.e., I'm not going to stick my husband between me and my relationship with the divine, because then I have to perform all of those responsibilities in the oikonomikos. And she doesn't want to do that, right? She doesn't want to be a domesticated woman. She wants to be a woman in possession of her own agency to cultivate this particular relationship. All right, let me give you one last account and then we'll end the lecture on that portion. And in the last little chunk of the class, I'll go into a bit more of a discussion of the readings that I had for students and anything I can do to support them to make sure that we're all progressing okay. So let me give you this last account and then we'll stop our class for today. And I hope I've enticed you to stay with us in future ones. So once Rabia passes by Hassan's house, this is on page 37. Hassan has his head out of the window and he was weeping, as he often did. As his tears fell on Rabia's dress, she looked up and she thought at first that it was the rain, and then realized that it was Hassan's tears. She turned to him and addressed him. Master, she said, this weeping is a sign of spiritual languor. Guard your tears so that there may surge within you such a sea that seeking the heart therein you shall not find it save in the keeping of the King of the Omnipotent. These words distressed Hassan, but he kept his peace. And then one day when he saw Rabia while she was near a lake, he threw his prayer rug on the surface of the water where it floated and called, Rabia, come, let us play two rakas here, two cycles of the prayer here. Hassan, Rabia said, when you are showing off your spiritual goods in this worldly market, it should be things that your fellow men are incapable of displaying, i.e., not that great a trick, buddy, like just being able to put your carpet on top of water. Then she flung her prayer rug into the air and flew up on it. Come here, Hassan, where people can see us, she cried. Hassan, who had not yet attained that station, said nothing, and then Rabia sought to console him. Hassan, she says, what you did, fishes also do, and what I did, flies also do. The real business is outside both these tricks, and one must apply themselves to the real business. So, what she is, again, in this kind of encounter, often saints are going to display mystic abilities, mystic tricks, being able to float on air, being able to stand on water. In one of the most famous mystic stories from Sudan, the mystic takes his shoe off and he whips it off into the air and it flies 20 kilometers and hits a thief dead who's robbing some people. So, in these kinds of mystic stories, we know from our kind of questioning mind that it's hard to accept that these tales. Could be true. I see that there is a question. Let me just see. What a great couple. If that was the only question, that's a good one. If there's anything else by an attendee, if you're welcome to type it into the chat, and I'll do my best to try and answer it. But Rabia al-Basri is a very, very famous character. There's hundreds of legends about her. She becomes one of the chief intercessors in these kind of tales, a little bit because of her gender, because it's meant to operate as a chastisement to men that a woman would achieve this extraordinary station. And I realize that's a kind of gender dynamic that is less acceptable to us today, but that's often how male writers would use her as a tool to correct men in their wrongheadedness. And so that's how she appears in a lot of these legends, and also this kind of one-upmanship of someone else who's considered a very important figure is not a risk to men, right? So men who are following the path should not feel threatened by the fact that this woman is more capable than them because you are not a woman. So you don't have to kind of rank yourself in the same way as her, even though Attar is technically claiming that she might be a man in the pursuit of God. Wonderful. So with those questions answered and those comments made, and these first two characters introduced, Hassan Basri and Rabia al-Adawiya, I hope that we've gotten us kind of thinking about what these Sufi figures will look like and what their stories will look like. And in this early period, just to reiterate an important point, if you were to think about the first two generations of so-called Sufis, or first three generations of Sufis, they are going to be associated with things such as weeping, fear of God, nervousness, some small miracles, and a world rejection. Now that is going to evolve in time, and it's going to, in the 19th and 20th centuries, you're going to see Sufi shrines that look nothing like anything that Hassan and Rabia are describing in places like Pakistan. We're going to discuss how those fit into this narrative as well. But at this point, we're going to stop the lecture there. Members of the public are welcome to stick around, although it is a bit boring since it's mostly housekeeping. But thank you again for those of you that took time out of your busy lives to attend. Here, I will stop the recording, and I will be around to answer some questions for the students and to get a bit more into our reading. So thank you again for joining us. Goodbye.